It's Anthony Semann from Semann Slattery, and I'm pleased to be joined by Professor Peter Moss, the 2023 Semann Slattery Thinker in Residence. I want to acknowledge that we're filming on the land of the Gadigal people, which is part of the Eora Nation. And Semann Slattery maintains its commitment to undo the harmful and ongoing effects of colonisation, alongside Indigenous and non-Indigenous colleagues. All right, I'd love to talk about pedagogical documentation. And when one speaks of Reggio Emilia, one can often refer to pedagogical documentation as maybe a tool that's used or mobilised within that educational project. How do you see pedagogical documentation or your reading of pedagogical documentation being philosophically aligned to the project of Reggio Emilia?
Right, okay. Well, first of all, I should say that I have not been a practitioner of it. I'm somebody who, as you say, has a reading of it and finds it very interesting in terms of my wider thinking. And it also, I've had discussions with Gunilla Dahlberg about this, who is a much deeper, has much deeper understanding about it than I do. And I think she once told me that the term pedagogical documentation came out of, in a way, trying to differentiate it from simply documentation.
Yes.
The sort of observation and note-taking sort of.
Is it true she coined the term?
Well, it's a bit hazy, but
right.
it might be. It might be. Yeah, I hesitate to go back to original owners in case somebody else claims it first.
Sure.
But I think the point about it is, it's not just documentation. It is then worked upon in a process of what could be called meaning making or research, deepening understanding, which is done through a collective process in which acknowledges and indeed values subjectivity. It recognises that people see things, understand things in different ways, and therefore those different understandings should be brought to the table, so to speak. But at the same time, they should be open to what the Italians use this word confrontation. They use it quite comfortably. And it means of obviously somebody challenging or asking somebody to kind of explain more, or saying, in a way, bringing a degree of rigour into the whole process. So people have to be able to articulate and not just say, oh, it looks to be like that. So yes, it has that whole element that is a collective process of meaning making to it, and that seems to be so it's documentation plus interpretation, and interpretation always with others, which could be obviously teachers, but it could also be citizenry. There's no reason. Malaguzzi used the term that he wanted a transparent school, and documentation was one way of making it transparent to, and if you like, that's where we go down a possible road marked democratic accountability. And it can also be children. And interestingly, my colleague Alison Clark, who has developed something called the mosaic approach, which is a way of young children being able to give their perspective, their view on various things, and has, I think, quite a lot in common. She invariably works with children that she gathers. For example, she will get children to go around a centre with a camera and take photographs of things that are important to them, things they don't like or whatever. And then she will bring those documents together with children, and the children will talk about them. In other words, they will provide their kind of interpretation. And that's just an example of how documentation can and often can involve children as well as adults. So I think it's like those two elements. It's finding various ways of documenting, but it's also what you do with them.
Yes. Let's get a bit political here around this talk globally around assessment of children. What are your thoughts about the current culture of assessment at a macro and micro level?
Well, I had a spate of writing articles before COVID, because OECD, the big international organisation, which has become a very big player in education, including PISA, which many people
Yes.
will know about this. But basically, it's extending all sorts of global assessment measures on all sorts of different subjects. And before COVID, it was wanting to start assessing globally 5-year-olds in what they call their International Early Learning Study. And they actually did a sort of pilot run in which they managed to persuade 3 countries to participate, the US, England and Estonia. And myself and other people, including Gunilla, but Alan Pence and a variety of people, we got stuck in writing critiques about this, saying that we thought this was deeply problematic. It took no account, but it took no account of critiques of the whole kind of standardized assessment. It took no account of hugely differences in context, which of course is a problem with all these kind of huge cross-national studies. You're dealing with children and young people in very different environments. You're asking them essentially the same questions. So yes, I think that I see that PISA and OECD was an egregious example of something that's going on in a lot of national. In my own country, England, for example, we now conduct testing on children at 4 and 5 years of age, different types, but still applying the standard methods to them. And again,
I assume they're not called tests.
One is called is assessment. Reception baseline assessment,
right,
or early years foundation profile. So they have slightly, but essentially that's what they're doing, because you end up with numbers. Increasingly they digitize, so teachers sort of put answers in and they disappear up somewhere on there. So there's a lot of this around, and it is very, very problematic. And it comes back to this, to Malaguzzi and his scathing comments about Anglo-Saxon testology, which he said is a gross simplification of knowledge and robbing children of meaning, which I think sums up very well the problems with these things, because they give you no idea about individual children and what they are doing and what they could do.
You said at one of your lectures, which I wrote so quickly because it just really struck me, you suggested that if we don't change compulsory schooling, then compulsory schooling will change early childhood education. What might need to change, and do you see pedagogical documentation as a way of achieving this necessary change?
Yes, well, I in saying that, I was again, as in many things, not being original. There have been, of course, a lot of people in recent years have flagged up what has been, I think, unfairly called schoolification.
Yes.
I think it's unfair because I don't think schools have to be in any. I think we can have schools of all sorts, and therefore, what we really mean is a particular pedagogical approach. So I think you could call it standardization or something. It's a pushing down of inappropriate methods and goals and it probably occurs throughout the education system. There's a pushing down process from each sector to the one below it, because each sector says we need the children delivered to us, ready to learn, or whatever the expression is. So I think that poses the question that if early childhood's job is not just to prepare children for school, which is a very common discourse, certainly in England and I think in other countries, then we do need to think what sort of relationship there could or should be between different sectors. And in a book I edited 10 years ago, I got various. I wrote an essay in which I set out what seemed to me some possible different relationships, and I got various people to respond to them. People like Margaret Carr and the late John Bennett, and somebody from Norway and so forth. And again, that was trying to open up that there is more than one possibility here. But what I was very inspired by was a paper that Gunilla and a colleague wrote in the early 1990s for a Swedish government committee which was thinking about the relationship between preschool and school. And it was the best thing I'd ever seen because it actually analysed what the problem was of bringing these two sectors together. And what they were really saying is, if you look at it in Sweden anyway, that primary education and preschool education have very different cultures and traditions. They see different children. They also have very different practices. So what are we going to do if we don't want one simply to take over? And they talked about the idea, the concept of pedagogical meeting places where people from different sectors could work together to understand difference, but then to co-construct a new shared understanding and sets of practices, which might include pedagogical documentation. So it was very interesting that they were trying to say, okay, we don't want preschool to be overwhelmed by inappropriate. So what's the problem and how do we deal with it? So this idea of pedagogical meeting places has always seemed to me to be a really important one. Once you acknowledge that the relationships at present between different sectors are a bit tricky, because there is a tendency for the higher one to constantly push down on the lower one in terms of age.
Now, was it yourself who talked about places of encounter, that early childhood in schools, and we can...
Well, it was Gunilla and her
Gunilla.
colleague who wrote back in 1984 that we want to develop pedagogical meeting places.
Meeting places,
yeah.
yes.
Places of encounter.
Places of encounter.
Where people from preschool come together and work on these things. Of course, that presumes a lot.
Yes.
And I don't know many, if any, examples of that happening, but it seemed to me that they actually put their finger on, that you have to start from understanding why there is a problem.
Correct.
And then you could perhaps move towards thinking about a way out of that.
Yeah. I have a final question around this. You talk about conformity and obedience being a very dangerous place to be. How maybe it doesn't, assessment risk making children obedient and conform, and how might we challenge this?
Well, I think those words were coming from the words of the mayor of Reggio Emilia when he was being interviewed about why, when he was the mayor, they thought it was important not only to open schools, but actually to develop the pedagogy which had this strong emphasis on the child's perspective. And he was saying, of course, we'd suffered 20 years of fascism, and we knew what it was for people to feel they had to behave and conform, and we did not want that again. So we wanted a pedagogy that actually nourished the idea of not being like that. And again, Anglo-Saxon testology and prophetic pedagogy do tend to slip into that mode, because of course they are premised on the idea that we know the outcomes we need, and our task is to get children to conform to those outcomes, and that's why we do why we encourage the pedagogy we do, and why we then use testing and assessment in the way we do to see whether they tick the boxes. So yeah, and that leads you into the whole thing that then what you're only looking for is what you want and expect, and then you never look at the whole vast range of things that are going on, which might be amazing and wonderful and all that sort of thing.
I remember hearing someone say, if you've determined who the child is going to be, how will you ever be surprised by them? Yeah. So that's the place of wonder. Absolutely.
And it's very contrary to this idea of education as this process of self-formation and realisation of potentiality, in which you don't know where it might go. Of course, but there are some things you want children to learn and so on, and I think you can weave that into it as long as you hold strongly to the idea that education is not simply a process of transmission.
Well, maybe the closing statement should be that disobedience is a necessary tool and strategy for people who work in education, not just to make trouble, but that famous quote of making good trouble.
Yes, okay, yeah, I could go with that.
We could go with that.
I could go.
Fantastic, thank you so much.